Good morning, nice to see you all. First question to you, does anyone recognize this guy behind me? Very handsome man. This is Niccolo Machiavelli, and throughout history has a bit of a bad reputation. But when you think about the John F. Kennedy quote we just saw about change being the constant of today, actually Machiavelli had some pretty good advice. And that's my job actually as head of the Future Institute, is really to help clients to understand that they need to constantly be agile and to change and respond to what's happening around them. Here's an example of somebody who maybe didn't quite get that quite so much. So the Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys. And this was the guy who at the time was chief engineer of the British Post Office. And so you can see actually that there's a problem that when you look outwards into the future, if you focus on what you see today and extrapolate, that's actually the worst way to look at it. In fact, what you need is to start outside and come back in. And so what I'm going to do for you in the next 20 minutes or so is go really macro and really generic, and then we'll work our way back into the relevant trends for your industry. At KPMG, we have 6 big megatrends, 6 big buckets of information, if you like, about the future. You can see the top 3 there, demographics, technology, and environment. They really lay the foundation stone for the change that's happening around us. And the bottom 3 are much more about how individuals, governments, and organizations respond. And I'm just going to take you on a very quick kind of whistle-stop tour through all of that today. And we'll start with demographics. And I'm going to start with another question to you. So by 2050, the only continent with a growing population. Any thoughts?
Asia.
Nope. It's Africa, which actually people often forget, and that's a really interesting thing. So when you look at the most populous countries in 2050, the top 3 no longer includes the USA. It actually becomes India, China, Nigeria, which is a really interesting shift in terms of where economic power balance sits. The middle class in Africa will grow faster and bigger than anywhere else in the world. What about the number of people over 65 globally? Any guesses? We're going to have a population of about 9 billion by 2050. Any thoughts?
More than 1 billion.
2 billion, absolutely right. Who said 2 billion? Well done, absolutely right. That's 4 times what it is today. And that's a really interesting question in terms of buying patterns, in terms of how people are living, in terms of healthcare, in terms of dementia, and so on. And actually, the biggest rise we're going to see in dementia will be in the emerging markets, because obviously we've got an aging population for the first time in many of those markets. Interesting fact, in the UK, the Queen currently writes 15 100th birthday cards a day in the UK, which is a huge number. And we're at a point in time where we have 14,000 centenarians in the UK, people over the age of 100 years old, and that's growing all the time. Good news for women, not too many of you in the audience, but we do tend to live a bit longer than men, which is always nice to know. By 2050, what about the urban population then globally? What percentage do you think of the global population will live in cities? 75, bang on, absolutely right, 6.3 billion. And actually what that means is that between now and 2050, 1 million people a week will move to cities. And that's really interesting in terms of how we think about government, because traditionally we think about government as a state problem. But actually in the future, we could be starting to see the rise of city government. So in China, for example, 221 cities of over 1 million people by 2050. And actually negotiating at the city level may be more appropriate than negotiating at the state level. But what about our environment? Because there's a problem here. If you have kind of unchecked population growth, there are some things that might potentially slow us down, particularly the availability of natural resources. So let's just have a look at this quote here from Shell's latest set of scenarios for the future. The world will need between 40 and 50% more water, energy, and food by just 2030, so not even 2050. And of course, we talked a little bit about energy earlier, and we saw in the video there. And I don't know whether, if you watched the news this morning, you will have seen that the ability to find cheap and sustainable energy is being hailed as the great question of our times. And that's certainly true. And what we're starting to see is that actually it may not be the traditional energy providers that solve that problem, but it may be somebody like Google, because Google has all of your data. Google knows when you use energy, it knows why you use energy, it knows how you use energy, and Google is investing an enormous amount in renewables. So we could well come to a point in 10 or 15 years' time where your energy is supplied to you by Google, and at that point, the pricing situation will change dramatically, and we'll have to consider how we account for energy consumption. But there's a question here about whether we actually need more of all of those things or whether we just need to use them differently. And actually, energy is an interesting one because data will help us to use energy in a more sustainable way. But what about water? Any of you had this? You probably had this experience in Starbucks where they consistently are unable to spell your name. But did any of you have a cup of coffee this morning? Hands up. I know I had about 5, so yeah, great. So can anyone have a guess for me of how much water you think it takes to make that cup of coffee? From growing those beans, those Arabica coffee beans up in the mountaintops, to delivering it to you in Starbucks or Costa or wherever your chosen coffee shop is. Any thoughts? Much, much higher. Higher than 10 litres. It's 145 litres. That's the estimate. Because, of course, you've got to think about all the water right across the supply chain. So everything from very thirsty beans up in the mountaintop through to packaging, processing, shipping, transportation, then the cup that it arrives in, the plastic cup, all the water that's taken up in Starbucks and supplying you with that coffee. And at the moment, that kind of doesn't really matter to us because we don't pay the economic value for water. But some of the futurologists we were talking to are telling us that actually there is a point in time when water will probably reach the same price per barrel as oil. Now, at the moment, oil price is pretty low, so that's kind of okay, but still, that's a big increase on the economic value of water as we see it today. And there's some very good reasons for that. And I wanted to show you this picture. This is an area called the Tibetan Plateau, which sits between China and India. And actually, 3 of India's main rivers come through the Tibetan Plateau. And what we're already starting to see is that in China and India, we have 2 of the biggest competing economies in the world, as you know. They will be the most populous economies of the future. But actually, China is already starting to divert water out of the Tibetan Plateau, so it will never actually reach India, which is an interesting question if you've got a big supply chain dependency in India and a dependency on water, because increasingly that's going to become a source of conflict. And actually, this is one of about 50 potential zones of water conflict that the UN has identified. So over the next 10 years, I think we'll see some big change on that. More food. So we reached the first time last year when the number of obese people globally was higher than the number of people starving. Really interesting point in time. So we have to think about some interesting alternatives to traditional ways of eating. And I took this photograph in a restaurant in London the other day. Mexican crickets cooked with onions and chilies to create a nutty salsa. Anyone fancy? Some of you may eat insects already. Anyone already eat insects? Anyone would like to try it? Great, because I need a volunteer, because I've got some. This is a cricket flour protein bar. And actually, it's been heralded as the great alternative to traditional protein because it's healthy, it's sustainable, it's cheap, and it's available in the ecosystem. And the interesting thing about this bar is that it was actually crowdfunded. So there was no R&D spend to create this. It was crowdfunded by customers. So thank you for volunteering. This is cocoa nut. I just have to say, you'll be fine, unless you've got a shellfish allergy. Okay, good, good.
Thank you.
You can give us your verdict on it. So I've got another one here if anyone's just too shy to come up and ask. So that's food, and expect to see a lot of innovation around food. And you've probably already seen the lab-grown burger, and the guys in Switzerland who grew a burger in the lab. And I actually met a couple of those guys recently, and they said there's no barrier to our being successful in this except funding. And they're currently going through a big funding round. They predict in 5 years' time they'll be selling those burgers in every supermarket globally. So, interesting prediction. What about the way that we're responding to all of that? And it's interesting that most of us think about scarcity as something that needs to be regulated. So actually the traditional response to scarcity of resources is to tax them, put the price up, make them more difficult to access. But what we're starting to see is that that's not necessarily the best way to respond. And there's a big behavioral shift called collaborative consumption that we're starting to see globally. Have any of you heard of the term collaborative consumption, sharing economy? I don't know if any of you are starting to see Uber being used as part of the supply chain network or as a delivery mechanism. We're starting to hear rumors of that happening. So Uber being used by retailers and so on to do deliveries. And that's a complete shift in the traditional way of thinking about that supply chain. What about this one, though? Because I think this one really sums up what's happening around trust. So there is a website called Borrow My Doggy. Have any of you heard of this? The interesting thing about collaborative consumption is that trust is built like that. You know, it's in a moment. It's a digital connection, and suddenly you trust the person. And I tried out Borrow My Doggy because I just couldn't quite believe that it was a real thing. And all you do is you go and meet the owner of the dog, take the dog for a walk with the owner, and suddenly you can take that dog for a walk anytime you like, and you pay kind of £6 a year to do that. Now, that works really beneficially for both, but what's fascinating is the level of trust that's created there. And for businesses, that's a huge opportunity. And of course, every time we do these sessions, someone always says to me, is Borrow My Child available yet? But I think we're a little way away from that, unfortunately. Of course, the flip side of all of this behavioral shift and the kind of the people-powered change is that it can sometimes work as a negative in terms of your stability and security around your supply chain. So Arab Spring is a perfect example of that. And we were talking about food scarcity earlier. The trigger for the Arab Spring was, of course, massive fluctuation and volatility in wheat prices. So when I was talking to clients in South Africa just after Christmas, they were telling me that they fear an African spring anytime soon because inequality is a huge issue in that economy. But equally, if you look at any set of trends for the next 10 to 15 years out, inequality is one of the biggest themes that you'll see. So I think we can expect to see a lot more of this social disruption happening as well. What about technology? I just want to whiz you through some really big examples very quickly. Robotics. We all think about the kind of either the Terminator or the production line robot. But I don't know if some of you have seen the big investments that Google is making around empathetic robots. So robots that will live at home with you and be your company in your old age, in that lonely time when none of your family are surviving. There's a new hotel opening in Japan in the next couple of months where every single member of staff is a robot. And every single member of staff looks exactly the same. They all have these female, kind of friendly female faces, and they'll take your luggage, they'll check you in, they'll clean the room, all of that stuff. So things that seem very far away are actually much, much closer than you might think in terms of robotics developments. And actually, we're seeing the automation in transport, of course. So automated cargo ships, automated trucks, automated cars. And actually, there's a great statistic about automation that today, 47% of all jobs in the USA could be automated with technology that already exists. So automation becomes not a practical question, but an ethical question and a social harmony question, because there may come a time when governments have to offer an incentive to employers to employ people rather than robots, even though it may be cheaper to do the latter. What about 3D printing? And do any of you use 3D printing or work for organizations that do? Brilliant. I tried to bring our KPMG 3D printer, but people do have a tendency to tamper with things if you leave them out in the open and it's broken. So what I've got instead is just, this is a 3D printed, it's a toy, but it's a great example because of obviously huge applications of 3D printing in medical care, vertebrae, replacement body parts, replacement organs now we're seeing increasingly. L'Oreal is 3D printing skin to use as a testing bed for its products. And that's happening today. The interesting thing about 3D printing, of course, is that something can come off of the printer already able to do this, so with all of that function built in. So there's no need for an assembly line. And similarly, actually, you'd probably print it out at home. So it transfers all of the control to the customer, and it means the supply chain shifts. So you're no longer shipping this, but you're shipping the plastic powders that you need to make this. So a real shift in terms of where things come from and go to. And what about this? This is a great example of technology, digital technology as an enabler. Do any of you use Etsy? So Etsy is an online marketplace for small businesses who make artisanal products. And this is a big threat to the luxury industry, because traditionally, luxury has been all about little guys in Swiss workshops making tiny watches and selling them for a fortune. And now what we're seeing is that from your bedroom in Liverpool, you could make something of very high quality and sell it and distribute it on Etsy. My friend's 2 children, they're using this to build up their university fund. So they go down to the beach, collect pebbles and broken glass and sell them to people who do crafts online. Incredible business model. Not much intervention from the tax man yet, but of course all of the shipping and logistics in relation to that go through the post office currently. So huge revenue earner for them potentially. The last thing I just want to end on is to think about the impact of all of this at the corporate level, and there's some big shifts happening. So if you think about the Standard & Poor's 500 index in the USA, that's the sort of big bellwether of corporate success. Back in about 1917 to 1935, average lifespan of a company in the index was 85 years. So we expected companies to be around for a really long time. Back in the 60s, it went down to about 35. Today, it's around 20. And by 2025, we're anticipating it'll be about 5 years. So if companies only have a 5-year life cycle, as big successful companies, how do you plan around that in doing business? And actually, where does that fit with the challenge that we heard to companies earlier, that companies that have values can really make an impact in the world, but maybe they've only got 5 years to do that. So a really interesting set of volatility. Big message, more change all the time. Get used to it, it's the new normal. Thank you very much.